Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm Jjigae, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. Tonight, we are traveling back in time to South Korea in the 1950s, shortly after the Korean War. What you may not have known is that South Korea during this period was home to a burgeoning film culture, one of many golden age cinema that flourished in Asia during the post-war years. And one of the most prominent filmmakers of the time was Han Hyung-Mo, director of the era's most glamorous and popular women's pictures, including the blockbuster Madam Freedom. And we are thrilled to welcome Christina Klein to the Korea Society to talk about Han Hyung-Mo's films. Professor Klein is Associate Professor of English and Director of American Studies at Boston College. She's the author of the books Cold War Orientalism, Asia in the Middle Brow Imagination, and Cold War Cosmopolitanism, period style in 1950s Korean cinema, which was published by University of California Press. The ebook version of Cold War Cosmopolitanism can be downloaded for free through the open access program, but you can also always buy a copy of the book. So welcome to the Korea Society, Professor Klein. Thank you so much for joining us. And a quick reminder to our viewers, you can send your questions to Professor Klein via Twitter at Korea Society Art or email artsandculture@koreasociety.org. So Professor Klein, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Jace. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to the Korea Society. I'm thrilled and honored to be here. It's a real pleasure. I'm only sorry we can't all be in person together in the same room, which would be so nice. I have a bit of a slideshow, which I am going to share, and I think it'll take about 15 or 20 minutes, and then I guess we'll come back for conversation. So let me start with sharing my screen. Alrighty. I want to start by saying a little bit about how I came to write this book, my recent book. I'm an American Studies scholar, and my research focuses on the U.S. and Asia, cultural encounters between the U.S. and Asia during the Cold War period. And my first book, Cold War Orientalism, focused on American representations of Asia, things like Rodgers and Hammerstein's musicals, like The King and I, which is the picture that's on the cover. I am not a Koreanist by training. I don't speak Korean. I don't read Korean. My family's not from Korea. So working on this project really took me pretty far out of my comfort zone. But I think that there's real value in crossing these kind of disciplinary boundaries and cultural boundaries, because sometimes outsiders find different things interesting, or they see different things, or they ask different questions. So the second book, Cold War Cosmopolitanism, really began when I watched Madam Freedom for the first time. This is a film that was made in 1956 and directed by Han Hyung-Mo. And at the time, I was supposed to be working on a book on the relationship between Hollywood and contemporary Asian cinema. And I was taking a deep dive into South Korean film, contemporary South Korean film. And I kept coming across references to Madam Freedom as the most famous and the most influential film of the post-Korean War period. So I decided to take a bit of a detour and watch it. The film tells the story of a middle-class professor's wife who takes a job in a Western luxury goods shop to supplement her husband's income. The job immerses her in Seoul's post-war society of dance halls and cafes and restaurants and consumer goods. And before long, she's going on dates with her handsome young neighbor, who you see right here, and even having a full-blown affair with her boss's husband. As an American Studies scholar, I was really drawn to Madam Freedom because it was simultaneously familiar and foreign to me. That on the one hand, the film's style was clearly indebted to classical Hollywood cinema, and it looked similar in many ways to the American films of the 1940s and 50s. Films like Beyond the Forest from 1949, which is in the bottom corner, and this starred Bette Davis as a very unhappy housewife, and you can see how sullen she's looking right there. So that was the familiar part. On the other hand, Madam Freedom was clearly rooted in contemporary conditions in post-war South Korea, and at the time I was not so familiar with them. There's a subplot about smuggling that I didn't quite understand, and the husband in the film is a scholar of Korean languages, so I had a feeling that I was missing some of the film's nuance. I also didn't understand how such a technically polished film could have been produced a mere 3 years after the end of the Korean War, when the country was still struggling to rebuild and was among the poorest countries in the world. But I was so transfixed by the film that I lost interest in the book that I was supposed to be writing, which did not make my editor very happy, frankly. And instead, I started watching all of Han Hyung-Mo's movies that I could get my hands on, and I loved all of them. What really stood out to me were the female characters. They were strong, independent women. Their actions drove the stories. They engaged in remarkably modern behavior. And they were also dressed in fabulous 50s clothes, which I liked to look at. I was really hooked by these films. So I gave up that other project and I decided to write a book about Madame Freedom, about Han Hyung-Mo and his other films, even though a good number of people told me that that wasn't a very good idea, but I decided to do it anyway. So after about 10 years of ceaseless toil, the book was published just in this past January. And I'm proud to say it is the first monograph on this important director to be published in English or Korean. I'm interested in Han not as a unique artistic genius, but as more of an exemplary figure, which is to say that he was exceptionally good at working in a style and expressing ideas that were in wide circulation in South Korea in the 1950s. So let me say a bit about this context before I get into the films themselves. The book's subtitle is Period Style in 1950s Korean Cinema. And I borrow this term, period style, from art history and material culture studies. And the scholars in those fields use it to refer to a style that is common to a range of cultural products that are produced during a specific historical period and that express broadly shared ideas and values. So Cold War cosmopolitanism is my term for this period style that we see in the 1950s. And this term, Cold War cosmopolitanism, seems to be something of an oxymoron because the Cold War, as it is conventionally understood, was about dividing the world into separate blocks and establishing barriers to prohibit movement really between them, to police those boundaries. But the Cold War was also a force of integration as well as division, and it required the binding together of the non-communist nations, the non-communist parts of the world, into these new entities known as Free Asia and the Free World. These were not natural entities. They did not come together just on their own. They really had to be created. It was a political project of creating Free Asia and the Free World. And a lot of political and cultural energy in the 1950s was expended to incorporate South Korea into these international entities and to encourage Koreans to see themselves as connected to other quote unquote free people around the world, people in the United States, people in Western Europe, people in Asia, and other parts of the world. So this is really what I mean by the cosmopolitan dimension of 1950s culture, which is all the ways that Koreans were engaging with foreign people and foreign things within a Cold War framework. So Cold War cosmopolitanism, as I'm defining it, has four major main dimensions. And the first of these is a political dimension, that it was a political discourse that was used by Koreans and Americans both that emphasized South Korea's membership in the free world and its incorporation into Cold War networks, such as the web of US military bases that stretched across Asia and around the world. Second, Cold War cosmopolitanism had a social dimension, and it entailed an optimistic attitude towards Western-style modernity and a belief that Koreans should let go of certain aspects of their Confucian heritage and replace them with liberal Western values, such as individualism and freedom, which were being heavily promoted as part of the kind of Cold War ideology. So this proved a boon to Korean feminism, which was just starting to move into the mainstream in the 1950s. And feminist leaders such as Helen Kim, who was president of EY University, and Lee Tae-young, the country's first lawyer, embraced this Cold War cosmopolitanism for their own ends. They believed that women's emancipation was an essential part of modernity, and so they used cosmopolitan ideals and they used Cold War institutions to push for their feminist ideals and for women's emancipation. And this slide here is interesting because it shows Helen Kim in the pages of the USI magazine Free World in 1960. And the USIA was the main US propaganda agency. And it describes her as a symbol of emancipation to Korean womanhood. She has guided and inspired the feminist cause in her homeland for more than half a century. So you can see here the sort of overlap between Cold War institutions and what I call Cold War cosmopolitan feminism, that they could be sort of service to each other in various ways. Third, Cold War cosmopolitanism was a material practice of cultural production and dissemination that was linked to Cold War institutions. The US State Department, the CIA, and the US military all created pathways through which resources could flow into Korea and could be used by the Korean people to produce a wide variety of cultural products. So the Asia Foundation, for example, was a CIA-funded philanthropic organization that provided assistance to Korean artists and intellectuals. It provided paper, for instance, for book publishing, textbook publishing, newspaper, magazine publications, and it created the first commercial film studio and stocked it with equipment that had been imported from Hollywood, so modern, very up-to-date equipment. So this slide here, as you can see, is newsprint being brought in, and that was paid for and funded by the Asia Foundation. And finally, Cold War cosmopolitanism is what I call a cultural style. And it was characterized by borrowing openly from Western models, from the use of stylistic elements that were derived from Western models. So Madame Freedom, for instance, is full of Latin American music and dance and Korean, which we can see here in this scene. This is a Latin mambo band and dancer. And you can see she's doing a mambo dance, and you can even see the guy playing bongos kind of behind her and just to the right. And Korean magazines also regularly included images of Parisian-inspired fashion and sort of French bodily comportment styles of holding in one's body and walking. So to sum up, what I mean by Cold War cosmopolitanism is the expression of American and Korean efforts to modernize South Korea along Western lines and to incorporate it into the networks that were binding the non-communist world together. And I think it's an idea that helps us to understand something about Han Hyung-Mo's films and about the 1950s more generally as a distinct period in South Korean history. So let's turn to Han Hyung-Mo and his films. That's him on the right in a hat. Han Hyung-Mo was born in 1917 into an affluent Christian family, and he attended art school in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. And in 1941, he moved to Seoul to start working in the colonial film industry. He studied cinematography in Tokyo for 2 years and directed his first film in 1949, soon after the end of the US military occupation of South Korea. So with the outbreak of the Korean War, he began shooting war footage for the Department of Defense and making documentary films. Han's career really took off after the end of after the war, and he became an important player in the emerging commercial film industry. Madame Freedom was one of South Korea's first blockbusters. It attracted about 150,000 admissions at a time when the average imported film attracted about 30,000 viewers. So it was much, much, much more popular than imported films, which were themselves generally more popular than locally made films. And Madame Freedom earned the producers a lot of money. It was very successful and very profitable. And as a result of this, it had a really big impact on the film industry which was just starting to get up and running, because it demonstrated that a well-made Korean film could lure audiences away from Hollywood films, which were generally dominated the market, and could generate big profits for investors. So with a sense that money could be made by making films, then more money started flowing into the film industry. And the film helped launch what's later gets called the golden age of Korean cinema, which is that period from about 1954 to about 1972, in which filmmakers produced a steady supply of well-made, high-quality films that were very popular with Korean audiences. And many of them really focused, like Madame Freedom, on contemporary life and looking at South Korea and the changes and transformation that were happening at the time. So Han's most creative period stretched from 1954 to 1961. So the post-war 1950s were really his moment, and he was the most commercially successful filmmaker during this period. So he specialized in making women's pictures. And by women's pictures, I mean films that foregrounded women's experiences and women's perspectives. He was deeply interested in women's relationship to modernity and in women as barometers of the changes that post-war society was going through. So many of these female protagonists live ostentatiously modern lives, and they challenge patriarchal gender norms in all kinds of ways. But what I think is most important is that the women in his films are individuals, which is to say that they have an identity outside of their roles within the family as wives, as mothers, as daughters-in-law. And they also have agency, which means that they make choices that drive the storylines. They make things happen rather than having things just happen to them. And so this image here, I like this because there it is with the female character with a gun and pointing her gun at the man. You know, she's the one who's driving what's happening in this situation, and he has to respond to her. Han made Hand of Destiny in 1954, which is just 1 year after the end of the Korean War. And it tells the story of a North Korean spy who lives alone in a lavishly furnished Western-style apartment, which we can see here, and who takes a lover and supports him financially. She even takes him shopping and buys him new clothes so that he will look as modern and as affluent as she does, because otherwise he was working as a dock worker and was dirty and shabby and had torn clothes. So here they are outside a store, very similar to the store that appears in Madame Freedom. Han's characters often have professional careers. The heroine of Men versus Women is a doctor. Pure Love features an airline stewardess, and this is at a time when being an airline stewardess was the most glamorous job possible. And his film Because I Love You centers on a professional dancer who travels and tours internationally. Han's films sometimes included the work of real-life professional women. So A Female Boss, which centers on a female publisher of a women's magazine, includes about a dozen outfits created by Nora No, who was Korea's first fashion designer. So the film, which is shot in widescreen, you have a lot of these scenes with lots of women, multiple women in a scene, and each of them are wearing some other different remarkable outfit. Han's characters typically refuse to conform to the expectations of the men around them. So this is a scene from My Sister is a Hussy, and the heroine of this film is a skilled judo practitioner who resists getting married and spends most of the film beating up men who annoy her, and that includes a pair of men who sexually harass her in a park, and you can see that she's flipping him here, doing her judo on him and throwing him to the ground. And even she eventually does get married, and when her husband annoys her and slaps her, she throws him onto the ground and walks out of the house, leaving him moaning on the floor. And this is a scene in a film that I think never ceases to amaze when I watch it, and I think it has the capacity to sort of surprise a lot of people, I think, who watch it now. It seems quite remarkably modern. His film A Jealousy even features a lesbian character who wants to create a separate household with her beloved and thereby save her from what she calls the slavery of marriage to a man. So Han was not making films about the lives of typical Korean women, most of whom were living rural lives of really difficult hardship in these years. He was more interested in conveying the cultural trends and the shifting values in urban life. And he captured the aspirations of a modernizing society more than its mundane, everyday realities. His films, I think of them as offering up a vision of possible futures rather than a widely shared present. And the lifestyles that he depicts don't really become common until the 1980s or the 1990s. So they're sort of visions of the future, of possible futures, than they were depictions of, common, widespread, shared experiences. Han's films are not, however, simple advertisements for women's liberation, and I think it would really be a mistake to read them that way. Many of them end with the modern woman protagonist being punished in some way or restored to her proper, quote unquote, proper position in a patriarchal family. So Madame Freedom, for instance, ends with the wife kneeling at her husband's feet, as you can see here, as he chastises her for bringing shame and dishonor to the family. And scholars have typically focused on these endings as expressing the film's true meaning, that the ending is where the film says, okay, this is the position that the film is endorsing. And they have often characterized Han as a conservative director who is committed to restoring patriarchal norms. And I really disagree with this reading. I think I know these endings are often quite brief. They last often not longer than just a few minutes. And while they do restore the status quo of patriarchal norms, they can't erase the preceding 80, 90, 100 minutes that preceded these endings, in which these women controlled the narratives and asserted their individuality and lived very modern lives. So I think that Han's films are ideologically open films. And I take this openness as a mark of Han's astute commercial sensibility. He made films that could appeal to a broad range of viewers, from those committed to women's liberation to those who thought traditional Confucian gender norms were at the heart of Koreanness and needed to be restored. And I think that that's, he's making, there's no niche marketing in the 1950s for films. Like, he's making films for a broad audience. And so appealing to different kinds of viewers who would have different perspectives on how society was changing and ideas of modernization and modernity, his films really, I think, cover the bases. So let me wrap up by saying just a few words about what I call in the book Budae Jjigae cinema. And Budae Jjigae, as I'm sure that most of you know, means army-based stew. And according to local lore, it was invented by a Korean woman who worked in the kitchen of a US military base in Uijeongbuk. And she smuggled out processed meat like hot dogs and Spam and bacon and added it to a traditional Korean vegetable stew. And other ingredients were later added, like processed cheese and instant ramyeon noodles, which you can see here. And her creation was very popular, and it was adopted by other sort of food stall owners, and it gradually became a part of Korean national cuisine. And I use Budae Jjigae as a metaphor for post-war cultural production because it involves using American stuff and blending it with local stuff and creating something new and authentically Korean. I think this idea of Budae Jjigae cinema helps us to see really how creative post-war filmmakers were, and more broadly, how creative the post-war Korean people were generally. They had limited resources, and they used the material that the waging of the Cold War was making available to them. And some of that material included, camera equipment to make their films. It included props and costumes that would appear on screen. Sometimes it included money to travel to international film festivals. And the results was not some kind of second-rate copy of American culture, but really works of genuinely South Korean culture, authentically South Korean culture, and which I argue in the book has really been quite cosmopolitan right from the start. So thank you. That's the end of the slideshow, and I will return to Jay.
Thank you so much. I really, really love your metaphor of using Budae Jjigae as sort of what was going on in the 1950s. What struck me, because I'm going to be completely honest with you, before I read your book, I've always heard about Modern Freedom and some of the films, but I've never actually watched them. And what struck me when I actually got to watch them was how contemporary almost it felt. It didn't feel like something out of the 1950s. It felt something like it could have been made in the 80s or even 90s. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about the films. But before we go into that, I wanted to ask you about this one concept that you mentioned in your book, but we haven't heard it so far. And I think it will help some of our viewers. The concept of opera girl. You mentioned the whole idea of the new woman, which started sort of in the 1920s and 30s in Korea during the Japanese occupation. But there is this term called opera girl that specifically, I think, applies to women in the post-war era. And a lot of people do mention that the Han's woman, director Han's female characters are very much a prototype of the opera girl. So can you tell us a little bit about that concept?
Sure, sure. So the après girl, the term après means after. It comes from the term après guerre, after the war. And it was a term that was in wide circulation, and it was usually used to refer to women who were, who were decadent, who were selfish, who were consumer oriented, who didn't want to get married and have families, who were having sex for pleasure, who were, involved with American soldiers. And so it was a sense they were figures of this new society, the sort of the sort of chaos and social dislocations in the post-war period, and it was generally treated as a derogatory term. And these women's turned up in novels and in films and journalism. And what I'm interested in is I want to sort of recast that the negative connotations, because they generally get used as like, oh, if this is the modern woman, then look how awful she is, which only goes to show that our traditional gender norms are really the best ones. So don't break those. Look what happens when you violate these norms. It's a terrible, terrible thing. So what I want to do is sort of rescue or change the meaning of that term a little bit. And to not accept at face value that the après girl was ultimately a kind of conservative stalking horse, because I think that she is heir to the new woman, to the feminism of the early part of the 20th century. The society was changing so much after the war that women were really adopting very new social roles. So they were going into the workplace in significant numbers. And they were moving into jobs that were non-traditional jobs for women. So they would become a taxi driver, or they would work in white-collar jobs in offices, or they would work on U.S. military bases or the U.S. Embassy as translators or waitresses. Some of them were entering into the professions as journalists, as doctors, as pharmacists. So there's really this movement of women out into the home. And I want to sort of put that notion of the après girl into conversation with these larger social changes for women and the sort of opening up the world to women that was happening in the 50s, as well as with the emergence of feminism in the 1950s, which is starting, as I said, to come into the mainstream. And look at this, how these films are really, the women in these films are very much in conversation with what's the changes that are happening to women that were not always seen in such negative terms.
And I guess we could also argue that this idea of women sort of breaking down the barriers and pushing the boundaries during the post-war era, it's not unique to sort of the Korean War or Korean society. I mean, you see that happening basically everywhere in the world. Does it not? So in that sense, that really is a very cosmopolitan concept, isn't it? You see that in Germany, you see that in America.
Yes, absolutely. And you see it in Japan. And I think it's really, in a lot of ways, it's a function of post-war. What happens after wars? Wars change societies, they change norms, they change people's expectations, they change people's aspirations. And so absolutely that figure of the post-war woman, the woman in public, the après girl, you can find her in lots of different societies. And she is a common kind of social type around the world, as was the new woman, as was the modern girl earlier in the 20th century. So those ways in which, sort of South Korean, what's happening with the gender norms is common and connected to what's happening in other parts of the world as well.
And would it be going too far to argue that perhaps one of the negative connotation that is attached to term like après girl is sort of the resentment, and probably not just from male, but also female, to see this sort of new kind of forms and going down to something as petty, pretty basic things as men coming back from the war and thinking that maybe the, women working are kind of stealing their jobs and kind of resenting that.
Sure. I think people are always going to resent when somebody steps into their zone and does things that used to be their terrain. I mean, you see that all the time. Nobody wants to give that up freely. Right. And I think it's also just so many men were killed, so many men were wounded, and women really often had to step into that role of breadwinner. And again, that's not going to be always go smoothly. People are going to, men are going to be resentful of that. And I think it's also women can also be resentful of that. It's not a simple split between men and women. It can be that kind of change destabilizes everybody.
Absolutely.
People don't always like that.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the films of Han Hyung-Mo's films in details. By the way, I want our viewers to know that many of Han Hyung-Mo's films, as well as many of the Korean films of the second half of the 20th century, basically, are available for free streaming on YouTube, courtesy of Korean Movie Database and the Korean Film Archive. The YouTube channel is called Korean Classic Film, and it's completely legal and completely free. Unfortunately, not all films have English subtitles, but there are a few that do. And I just checked it today. Currently, the channel has about 5 of Han Hyung-Mo's films available for streaming. And one of the first one that always comes up when we talk about Han Hyung-Mo is Hand of Destiny, which, as you mentioned, was made in 1954. That it is made only within a year, basically, after the ceasefire of the Korean War. And then the fact that he made the sort of the main character, the heroine, a North Korean spy, I find that really, really fascinating. And this North Korean spy seems to be absolutely in love with all the Western sort of cultural products. It's reflected in the interior design, the clothes she wears, the music she listens to. So what do you think he was trying to tell the story? Was it just sort of this whole idea of having a North Korean spy as the main character? Was he just simply trying to find an interesting, sort of intriguing character, or is it like kind of his attempt at making sort of the Korean version of film noirs, that features all these female spies and the intrigues and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, you never know what anybody's intentions are, right? I didn't find any memos saying, well, what I merely meant to do with this film was X, Y, and Z. So we never really know for sure. But absolutely, it's a film noir. It's influenced by film noir, and you can see it in the use of lighting and the kind of characters. It is remarkable that she's a North Korean spy, and again that she's. And I think part of it is, he has to make the case for why does this woman live so luxuriously, right? Where's her money coming from? She's not married. She's not part of a family. She lives all by herself. She's obviously got a lot of money. Where's this money coming from? So that sort of works as a way to explain to where this money is coming from. But it's interesting is that she's not an unsympathetic character. She's not, officially she's a bad woman. She does bad things, but the film doesn't treat her as a bad woman in a certain sense, that it devotes a lot of resources to her. She's nicely lit. She has great costumes. Her apartment doesn't look dingy and shabby and threatening and menacing. So there's a way in which she's presented very attractively. And the thing that I find really most interesting about this is, she takes this lover, she sees this man once, she lays eyes on him once, she finds him attractive, she seduces him, right? She's very active. She's the one who initiates this relationship. She takes care of him. As I said, she takes him shopping. She spends money on him. He's sort of like a kept man that she's supporting him. She pays for their entertainment. When they go out, they play, I think, miniature golf. She pays for that. And they pretty clearly have sex. He spends the night. There's only one bed. There's no indication that anybody slept on the couch. So she engages in this behavior. The film does not really condemn her for this. The character, no character condemns her for this behavior. And even more interesting to me is that she always has the upper hand in this relationship, that she's the one who has sort of power over this man who's not only a man, but he's also, what is he? He's like a police officer, intelligence
officer.
Yeah,
it turns out, yes.
So he's looking for communists, right? He's looking for her as a subversive. And so he has all this authority of the state behind him. And yet she's the one who's sort of in charge of the relationship. And there's this great scene after they go shopping, they come back to her apartment and he's basically primping in front of the mirror and he's got his hat and his suit and he loves everything. And she's just looking at him and admiring him. It's like, ooh, look at what I got here. And it really is this reversion of, what in film studies we call the male gaze, which is the male gaze is looking at and objectifying and sexualizing women. And Margaret, the spy, she has the female gaze here, and he does not. and which is actually often the case in Madame Freedom as well, that it's so tied to the female characters and their perspective and their subjectivity, that I find that that's really interesting. And at the end, she is punished. She does have to die. She is killed, but she decides, she tells her lover to shoot her. So even at the end, she's in control. And I love it. And he like closes his eyes and looks away, and she doesn't look away. She's looking right into the camera, and he shoots her. So even at the end, she has the gaze, and she's the stronger one. So it's really quite remarkable in 1954.
Yeah. And speaking of the last scene, if you know Han Hyung-Mo's filmography, you'll do very well on like Korean Trivial Pursuit, because he's like first of many. And the reason a lot of the Korean people may have heard of Hand of Destiny is not because they've seen the film, because it is known, it's the answer to the Trivial Pursuit question of which Korean film featured the first ever on-screen kiss. And it happens at the very end, but throughout the film, like there's so much teasing going on from the director. So it's, it almost looks like they're gonna do it, but then they just hug, and then it looks like it's about to happen. It happens so many times in the film, and it's almost like a teaser. And you kind of want to go like, he knew that if he put a kiss scene in this film, that would just cause this absolute sensation and scandal, so that it's almost like that's where he was going, and he wasn't going to show it until the very end. I mean, do you think that's what kind of happened? And again, that kind of shows his skill as a filmmaker, doesn't it?
Yeah. He was known, his colleagues in oral histories from filmmakers in the period, they talked about him that he was very concerned with showmanship, in the sense in that he wanted to give viewers a good value. He wanted to give them a show. He wanted to present them with something. And so his films really, he always has something that's going to be interesting. It's going to be a sex scandal. It's going to be a kiss. It's going to be a musical number. It's going to be some celebrity. It's going to be fashionable clothes. It's going to be something. It's going to be a lesbian. Oh my God, what could be more interesting? Let's have a lesbian, right? Or let's have a woman who beats up her husband. Also very interesting. So there's this sense of he's very much in tune with popular tastes, popular desires, trends, fads, social changes. And he tries to put it all into his films to attract audiences and to attract viewers. So he really had an excellent sense of what people wanted to see. And the kiss, like he's trying to push the limits of what can be shown. And so sometimes he ran into trouble with the censors. With Madame Freedom, he did have to cut some material, but we don't, I think, really know what that was. But he's always trying to kind of push the limits. Yeah. And I think that these endings are sort of a way to, allow him to push the limits as far as he can, because, oh, by the way, she'll die in the end, or she'll be restored to her husband in the end, or she'll get down on her hands and knees in the end. So the endings are sort of required, but also are what kind of allow him to do what he does in the rest of the film, I think.
And then we cannot not talk about Madame Freedom, which was made in 1956. Hand of Destiny, as I mentioned, it's known for the first kiss scene, but apparently it wasn't like a huge commercial success. But then comes Madame Freedom, and as you mentioned, it's called a blockbuster. You said you talked a lot of people writing about Korean cinema, mentioning as one of the most influential, important film. Was it just because of how successful it was, or what is sort of the reputation of Madame Freedom to the people who are interested in Korean cinema and its history?
It is, as you say, an absolutely important film and considered to be really very foundational, I think, to post-war cinema. And for a lot of different reasons. Just as I said, it earned a lot of money and it was so popular. But also it was stylistically very innovative. And one of the things that is most known for is camera movement. So prior to this film, there hadn't been a lot of camera movement in Korean films, sort of a legacy of Japanese film style from the colonial period, which the camera just didn't move in a very ostentatious fashion. And at the time, it was seen to be, it might be disorienting to viewers, like, why are you going to move the camera? People will be confused. And Han Hyung-Mo said, no, I want to move the camera. And he built a camera crane, which is what they use in Hollywood, and which is one of the things that makes Hollywood films so attractive, was this incredibly mobile camera. And a camera crane is a kind of cherry picker-like device so the camera's on this cherry picker-like device, which is sitting on a wheeled kind of platform or cart. So it can move backwards, forwards, up, down, sideways. It can just go anywhere. And so Madame Freedom is famous for basically the camera almost never stops moving. And almost every scene, it's just going, moving, drifting up, down, sideways, and very spectacularly. So in that sense, the film was a real stylistic innovation. Visually, as well as just really looking at contemporary society, and let's turn the camera and show what's happening right now. So for all those reasons, it was really just so innovative.
Yes, speaking of the contemporary society, so one of the things when I hear about Madame Freedom just being described, they very much emphasize the fact that she's the wife of a professor. Like of all people, it's like what's kind of implied is that of all people, the professor's wife, she, kind of has this flirtatious relationship with, well, first of all, she gets a job because she decides that she wants to make money. So she gets a job basically in retail, working at a boutique that's selling kind of luxury goods. Then she has all these kind of flirtations things going on, and then she's very interested in this young man who is her neighbor, and then she dances. And what's really kind of fascinating to see the dance scene is it does make me go like, did people even know how to dance like that at the time? I mean, so you mentioned sort of like Han Hyung-Mo basically creating sort of this scenes. It's more aspirational, not necessarily the reflection of what's going on. So this incredible scenes of the music performances and all these people dancing. Do you think that I should actually also mention that the Madame Freedom is based on a novel. So it's not that Han Hyung-Mo's original idea. So a lot of it is based on what the novelist wrote about. But that incredible scene in the, Han Hyung-Mo actually, in his a lot of movies, there's a lot of dancing going on. So what do you think it was? Was it that another way of him sort of signifying the sort of the modernness by showing the Western,
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And it was very realistic. And that's the interesting thing with his films is they are rooted very much in reality, but they're not necessarily widespread. Not all these women in South Korea are going out dancing, right? It's a sort of a small sector, but an important sector in urban life. So Western dance was very, very popular. And it was a real fad for it in the post-war period. It comes in with Western music and the GIs. The American GIs during the war and after the war. And there are these sort of dance halls everywhere. And they were, a lot of them were kind of illegal. They're getting busted by the police. There's stories in the newspapers of, sex scandals that are happening there. So it's a very scandalous scene in a scandalous situation. But it was actually quite real. And sort of the fantasy part, the aspirational part is the dance hall in the film itself, that there was no place in South Korea that looked like that dance hall in the film. And they based it on what they saw in Hollywood films and Japanese magazines and sort of what's happening in other parts of the world. And they built this incredible set. And they presented that very real fad of social dancing. And what's interesting is that that dance hall is built in a bombed out building in the railway station. So in the slideshow, that building that I showed, that devastated building, was in the Yongsan train station. And so that's where they filmed it, was in a bombed out building like that it was still, the walls were standing, but the roof had been blown off. And so it had a huge empty space, and that he could bring his camera crane in there. And the crane, coming back to just his style, that crane was an object of interest. It shows up in, magazines and newspaper reports, and because it was so unusual. And so there's that sense of him being so modern. He's a modern guy. He's a modern filmmaker, and that technology and that camera movement kind of signifies his modernity, as well as dance signifies the modernity of his characters.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the modernity of characters, what I didn't, because again, Madame Freedom, when you hear about it, it's about, professor's wife who runs off and
what could be more respectable than a professor?
But then I was a little surprised when I was actually watching the film that the husband, the professor, also has kind of a flirtation, and the flirtation that he has with, I guess he's student of the past, she is, as if not even more so, kind of a new woman than the modern woman than his wife is. She's absolutely beautiful, and she wears the most incredible costumes. So it's not just the Madame Freedom, Madame O in the film, who is pushing the boundaries. It seems like all the female characters are, and then there are all these other wives groups who are doing, all these, having fabulous parties and going out and trying to make money. They're all seems to be very much part of what's going on. As you said, it's not, they are sort of taking action. But also what I also found really interesting, speaking of fashion, was that that sort of flux state of what people are wearing in his films. But again, this is when the only sign that it's really from the 50s, because a lot of the times characters are wearing the Korean traditional dress, hanbok. I guess, people were still wearing that as, everyday kind of clothing. But then there are all these really fabulous Western clothes. And actually, the following film, A Female Boss, which was made in 1959, has probably like one of the most beautiful wardrobes that you will see. So let's talk about fashion.
Let's talk about fashion.
So again, this sort of the juxtaposition of the hanbok versus Western dress, how does he use that in his films, and what do you think that signifies?
Yeah, I really love this about the films, and I really was drawn so much into by the clothing. It was so interesting to me, and exactly because it's not like everybody's wearing Western dress. Like some women are wearing hanbok, some people are wearing Western dress, some people go back and forth in the course of the film, and so costume becomes a very element of an important way to signify meaning, to express meaning in the film, and so I was really interested in that, and I think what you see, and Han Hyung-Mo is not the only one to do it. He's really the first to bring in Western fashion, but he's not the only one. Other people pick it up. And it's really, I think, expresses characters who are open to change, open to social change, open to doing new things, behaving in new ways, moving away from, customary forms of behavior. And so clothes really signify it. And it's great because you can see it instantly, right? You look at a woman, is she wearing a hanbok? She's wearing a dress. And so it becomes it's a real visual shorthand, because it is in the 50s that women are starting to adopt Western dress and wear it more commonly, usually urban women, usually unmarried women. But I'm also interested in films like Madame Freedom, where the characters go back and forth. And it's a way in that I think it's not like modernity and tradition are black and white, polar opposites, you're one or the other, but the clothes allows us to see how women it's a kind of a continuum, and they're moving back and forth, and they're navigating it back and forth, and they're making choices about what to wear, and they're making choices about how to behave. And it gives that sense of sort of women are engaging actively with what's happening around them. They're not just passively being swept up in it. And clothes, I think, are a way to signify that element of agency and choice and participation, rather than just sort of passivity, which I think is quite interesting in the films.
Yeah. So I actually want to we're getting a lot of questions from the viewers, so I want to cover some of them. You talked about the sort of the Asia Foundation funding the film productions around Asia, not just in Korea, but, throughout the Asia. Do we know how Han's film was funded? Was he specifically receiving money from Asia Foundation, or is it Asia Foundation sort of uh, building the infrastructure for the filmmakers to do work on? Or like, do we know how the business was conducted in terms of production?
Yeah, we not everything, but we have a decent idea. Han Hyung-Mo his films were very commercially successful. He made money, so he didn't need the Asia Foundation, right? He didn't need Asia Foundation money. But what the Asia Foundation did is in the late 50s, 56, that there are 3 film studios open up within a few months of each other, really, 56, late 56, early 57. And the Asia Foundation, which is funded by the CIA, it's a CIA sort of front organization, builds the one that opens first. And then there's Samsung Studio, which is the company that made Madame Freedom, and they use some of the profits from Madame Freedom to open that studio. And then there's Anyang Studio. So there's 3 studios that open. And so what the CIA, the Asia Foundation studio was an automatic developing machine. So up until that point, everyone was developing film by hand. And this is a machine that just does it automatically. And it really increased the quality of the pictures immediately, because they're just, the exposures were better. Everything, the quality was better and more consistent. So everybody was using, the commercial filmmakers were all using that developing machine. And Han Hyung-Mo was using it too. And there's some records that are extant still of the companies that were using there's things like who's renting lights and who's shooting their film in the space and who's using the developing machine. And so he was definitely using it for some of his films, was using that space. But other people would have been a little bit more dependent on more of their resources if they weren't quite so commercially successful. But Han was not, he was not reliant. He also had a relationship with the Department of Defense, which had its own resources, because everybody in all these different government agencies have their own filmmaking units, right? They have their own equipment, they have studios, a lot of it coming from the equipment coming from the US or coming from the UN. They use it for educational films, training films, kind of propaganda films. And so like the Department of Defense is renting out its equipment and letting commercial filmmakers use its sound recording equipment. So I think Han was probably more involved with the Department of Defense studio and camera equipment than he was really with the Asia Foundation. He didn't need it quite so much.
Then a lot of people are asking this question of the audience sort of reaction to his films. Obviously, his films were very popular, so that means a lot of people went to actually see the films. But as I also mentioned before, even if you haven't seen the film, you've heard of that title, Madame Freedom. You just know it because that's how notorious it is, in a sense. What do you think? I mean, did people just found it scandalous and yet kind of enjoyed it? I mean, it's kind of hard to gauge, obviously, how people reacted to the films, more than 60, 70 years ago. But just what is your general sense of how Koreans at the time thought, what did they think of his films that's pushing all these boundaries and always having some sort of scandalous elements in it?
Well, that's really the big question, because people don't leave records, right? Nobody knows. People don't leave, cards like, I really like the film for this reason, or I hated it for this reason. So, you can look a little bit at reviews, but even a reviewer isn't really representative. They're sort of an intellectual, or they're an elite, or they're a man, or whatever. So they're not necessarily representative. So you don't really know for sure. And some of, the reviews of his films, could vary. So thinking about My Sister is a Hussy, there are these 2 reviews, and one says, thank God, great movie. There's that ending where she's restored. She gets, her father beats her. She gets married. She stays at home. She wears a hanbok. She doesn't go out in public anymore. She's been returned to a good Korean woman. And so that this reviewer likes it for that reason. And then another reviewer in a different newspaper says, what a great movie. It's so great to see this woman doing judo on men and being more stronger and more powerful than men. What a thrill. So I think people thought any number of things. I think there is a way, I mean, my guess, what do I know? I don't know. My guess is that part of the appeal might have been that you can go, women especially could go to these films enjoy the pleasures of watching somebody be transgressive, can sort of sit with them in their subjectivity. What's it like to be a modern woman? What's it like to cheat on your husband? What's it like to go to a nightclub? What's it like to go to this fancy Western restaurant, and sort of go with her and doing all the things that she does. And then at the end say, oh, she's punished. That's all terrible. And I can step out and go back into my regular, go home to my husband, go home to my children, go home to my sort of customary life. So I think that can have a kind of a double appeal. But what I tried to do, since you can't recover what the audience was really thinking, is to say, let's show how is the film kind of connecting to everything that else that's going on around in the world. And so one of the things that I was so interested in was, Korean feminism in the 1950s, which I wasn't expecting to find. I didn't know anything about it to begin with. But Helen Kim is president of IWA, and Lee Tae-young, the first female lawyer, they're really out there. They're critiquing the patriarchal family. They're critiquing the head of family system. Helen Kim had a 30-year relationship with a woman who was her life partner. In America, we call it a Boston marriage. She didn't get married. She didn't have children. She was a professional woman who lived with another woman. Lee Tae-young was really promoted. She had a very kind of egalitarian marriage with her husband, who was an opposition politician, and she taught at the law school. And, these are professional women, and they're really saying, marriage is slavery. And the traditional patriarchal family is really, really bad for women, and we need to change the laws. So there was movement in the culture, and these women are writing in magazines and newspapers. They're very much in the public eye. So there were these other attitudes about women that were circulating, in addition to the social change of just your average woman having to go get a job as a taxi driver. And I think that once, we don't know what audience members thought, but if you put the films in conversation with other things that are going on in the society at the time, it becomes harder to see them as just condemning these women because they're so bad, because they're breaking all the rules, because there are these ideas that are percolating elsewhere in the culture.
And then Han Hyung-Mo had this wonderful career, it seems like, and he did continue to make films in the 60s, but we don't hear a lot about what he did in the 60s. And it seems like he made his last film in the late 60s, and he kind of retired. And I think a lot changed in the 60s, and also perhaps change in the, what was going on and how people perceive the films and stuff. But can you tell us a little bit about what happened in the 60s and what happened to his career, but also the Korean films in general?
Yeah. So the 50s kind of end in a spectacular way with the Park Chung-hee coup. And, Park was really, there was a lot of sort of popular sentiment against this kind of decadent, modern, Western liberal culture. And so with Park, there was a real push towards austerity. So, let's crush he's like, let's get rid of the black market. So let's get all these black market goods and let's set them on fire, or let's push them into the ocean. And let's, stop drinking coffee and stop smoking American cigarettes and stop drinking Western liquor, and stop wearing these elaborate fashions. And let's go back to our sort of Korean values. So a push against this liberal Western culture and values, and also towards a kind of austerity and very much anti-consumption, anti-consumer culture that was linked to smuggling in the black market. And so that just sort of changes the sort of the society and cultures that Han's films were so much about, were these kind of affluent, dancing, restaurant going, coffee shop hanging out people. And that kind of came to a pretty sharp end after the coup. And so the world that he's depicting kind of ceases to exist. And what you see in a lot of films of the 60s, the style changes, is a more austere style, a less visually dense, a less visually elaborate style. And women are definitely, the era of the women's picture really ends. And there's Lee Man-hee's film Black Hair from 1964, which I take as a sort of anti-Madam Freedom, you know, it centers on a woman, but she's just horribly abused throughout the film and is treated badly by all the men around her. And she's not powerful and not glamorous and not in charge of her own life. And the film is shot in, you know, basement rooms, and there's no decor, and it's like set in a scene that looks like it's under a half-built like highway overpass or something. So there's a sort of a spareness and an ugliness and a kind of sense of poverty, and all that lush decor of Han Hyung-Mo's films is sort of kind of disappears from the films in the 60s. But there's also real changes in the film industry. Pak wanted to industrialize the film industry. And so in order to be allowed to make films, you have to have a certain amount of capital investment, a studio of such and such a size, a certain amount of camera equipment. And really nobody other than Shin Sang-ok could meet those requirements, so that the smaller independent producers just had a very difficult time making films. And Han did operate kind of as an independent producer as well as a director. So it was just, he just did not thrive. The society had changed, the culture changed, the industry changed, and he was no longer in that, in the position that he had been. And Shin Sang-ok comes up and is the more, sort of the commercially successful, the premier filmmaker of the period.
And I think we can just go on and talk about so many things, but unfortunately that's all the time we have. So thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful reintroduction to this world that we don't necessarily think too much about. And I truly enjoyed looking at that part of the history from a very different point of angle. And I really want to thank you for your book and for your talk, which I so fully enjoyed. So thank you so much, Professor Klein. And I hope you will write even more books about other people, no matter what other people say.
We'll see. But thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about these films. And thank you all of you out to Zoomland who came. This is really, it's been a pleasure for me.
Yeah. And I sincerely hope, even though some of them may not have English subtitle, visually it is just so stunning. Just taking a look at, take a look at some of his films. It is really absolutely a delight to watch those films. But so special thanks to Peter, our IT director, for making this live webcast a possibility, and to our interns Jjigae and Hee-ju for getting all the questions and doing email outreach and social media postings. And of course, our thanks to you, our members and viewers. We hope you'll join us again next week. Check out what's coming up on our website, koreasociety.org, where you can sign up to receive our emails or join us as a member. Thank you so much. Good night.